It's a very good evening from Westminster and welcome to this BBC News special where the House of Commons is preparing to hold two crucial votes which will determine the future of the Brexit process. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has pledged to make Brexit happen by the end of this month, but that depends to a large extent on the outcome of tonight's votes, and he's asking MPs to back his Brexit deal by voting for the legislation that the government has drafted, but he's also asking them to push the legislation through the Commons in the space of just 3 days. And now many MPs, it's fair to say, are very uncomfortable with being asked to rush through a piece of legislation that is so important and so complex. It was earlier today that the debate started at Westminster, with the Prime Minister making his case to MPs, lots of crowds outside still making their voices heard. Prime Minister threatening in effect to withdraw this bill if he lost the timetable motion and was faced with another long Brexit delay. So we'll be here with you to help you make sense of tonight's votes with the help of my panel, and I'll introduce them properly in a moment. But lots of expertise among the three of them, and indeed our correspondents inside the Palace of Westminster just behind me and beyond. Let's look inside the Commons chamber, because we will expect the first vote in about a few minutes' time, possibly. The Justice Secretary Robert Buckland closing for the government. So why don't we just join this now?
I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye! Of the contrary, no. No! Division! Clear the lobby!
So we joined the Commons just at the right moment, didn't we? That's the Speaker just getting up after the final speech, announcing this first division. Now, this first vote, MPs now filing out into the voting lobbies either side of the Commons chamber, the ayes and the noes. Now, this is on the bill itself. This is the piece of legislation, 110 pages of it, that is based on the bill struck by the deal that's struck by Boris Johnson in Brussels last week, and that's what the substance of this vote is about. We'll then move on after that to possibly an even more challenging vote for the government, which is on the timetabling. How much time do MPs get to scrutinise this very important piece of legislation? So that's the picture for you, and that's what we're expecting in the next half hour or so. And our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young, is inside the Houses of Parliament, in the central lobby, very close to the chamber of the House of Commons, where the voting is happening. And Vicky, talk us through this first vote.
That's right, as you say, the second reading of the bill, and just to make clear to people that a bill going through Parliament has various stages. The first one where it's debated is this one, so MPs have been talking about it all day. There is a vote, and it has to get through those votes in order to progress to the next stage, which would be where MPs look in detail at what the bill is about, and at that point they could maybe try to make some changes. Now, if this were to pass tonight, and I think the government is quietly confident they may have the numbers, it really would be the first time that MPs have backed any kind of Brexit deal in this very long process, almost 3.5 years since the referendum was held. Now, tonight it would depend on Labour votes, so it would depend on Labour MPs, many of them in constituencies where most of the people voted for Brexit. It will depend on them backing this and backing the Conservative government. The government side will be trying to keep down the number of rebels. They have some Conservatives who have been booted out of the Parliamentary Conservative Party who won't back this tonight. So this is the first stage where the government will be hoping that the House of Commons shows it does support Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. Now, it's a long road for that bill to get through, not just here, but also through the House of Lords. So it is fraught with difficulty for the government, even if it were to pass tonight. But as you say, probably even more contentious is the timetabling of it all, how quickly the government wants to push this through the House of Commons and the House of Lords.
As you say, Vicky, it would be very significant if the government carried this second reading vote, because, as you say, it would be the first time that the House had okayed any kind of Brexit deal, so let's not underplay the significance of that. But as you say, the motion on timetabling and how they manage this debate is likely to cause possibly more problems. Now, how do you see that going?
Yeah, and to explain again, I mean, when a bill goes through Parliament, it normally takes several weeks. On this occasion, the government wants the bit that has to be done in the House of Commons with MPs, they want it done and dusted by Thursday night. Now, given that this is a very significant piece of legislation, as we've said, it runs to a large number of pages. MPs are very upset about the fact that they feel it is being pushed through without proper scrutiny. Now, the flip side to that argument coming from the government and lots of Conservative MPs is that really they've been talking about this for 3.5 years. And even though Theresa May didn't get her deal through, quite a lot of this bill was what she was proposing all that time ago. Now, there are changes and differences, of course there are, but actually lots would say, well, look, you've had enough time really to discuss all of this. So that will be the contentious point, and I think what's going to happen is that some Labour MPs will vote for the deal and for the bill in the first vote, but they don't like the way that it's being pushed through here. So that could be the point where the government might come unstuck. I think that's going to be an incredibly close vote, and nobody I've spoken to today is willing to call which way that's going to go. They're all just saying it's going to be very close.
OK, Vicky, we'll be back to you obviously very shortly, and we're keeping an eye on the chamber of the House of Commons itself, which is fairly empty at the moment because MPs are voting, but we'll be back there as soon as we see any signs of activity of that vote being ready to be declared. But it should take at least, I would have thought, about 15 minutes or so, given the numbers voting. So let's just remind you of what's going on in the chamber. If you're just joining us, MPs are voting on Boris Johnson's withdrawal agreement bill. That's what it's called. Its purpose is to turn the Prime Minister's deal with the EU, his Brexit deal, which is a draft treaty, into UK law. But what does it actually cover? Well, it's a very comprehensive piece of legislation. It sets out how the UK will make so-called divorce bill payments to the EU for some years to come. It talks about how customs and regulations will work in practice between Britain and Northern Ireland. That's a hugely contentious area. It also refers to a new independent monitoring authority that will be set up to safeguard citizens' rights. So those are just 3 areas for you. There are many more, of course, but that gives you a sense of why lots of MPs think they need far more than 3 days to go through that in some detail. It's such an important piece of legislation. So let's talk about that and what we're expecting with my panel. Let me introduce them properly. Catherine Haddon from the Institute for Government, and we have the leader writer for the Daily Telegraph, Tim Stanley, and the former Labour advisor, Aisha Hazarika. Good of the 3 of you to join us. And I suppose, Catherine, first of all, we need to just underline to viewers how significant these events are.
Yeah.
We've been through this Brexit process. Lots of people are rather punch drunk.
Yeah.
But these votes coming up tonight are really very significant.
They really are. And also, let's remember how long it's taken to get here. Theresa May tried 3 times to get a meaningful vote through, so she didn't even get to this point. She was just trying to get initial approval from the Commons, then to be able to bring her bill to Parliament. Boris Johnson wasn't able to have that vote on Saturday, but now he's got this second reading, the ability to try and move the legislation into the chamber and get debating it properly. So this really is his meaningful vote. So if he passes this first vote, that's a huge win for him.
So that's significant, Tim. I suppose I'm bound to ask, really, do you detect among Conservative MPs a confidence that the second reading will go as planned? Are there any real concerns that the Prime Minister might lose that?
With the usual caveat that everything I say turns out to be wrong, most people are confident that it will pass the second reading, because although Labour will oppose, it's believed there will be sufficient numbers of independent MPs and rebel Labour MPs, people like Lisa Nandy or Gloria De Piero, who will probably support it. So the Conservatives are quite confident they'll get through that. The problem then, of course, is the programme motion that follows after it. Boris Johnson has set a political goal ever since he ran for leader of getting Britain out on time of October the 31st. That's why it's so very important. Plus, the Conservatives are worried about losing control of the bill, that in the next few days, if there's too much debate, it might get so amended that it's undermined and isn't the thing that they negotiated with the EU. That's why they're very keen to keep pressure up. So they'll be watching for how big the second reading vote is. If it's very big, that looks good for them. But after that, they are really putting everything onto the programme motion and maintaining control of the paper.
Because the problem, Aisha, is, of course, as we've been hinting, there will be quite a few MPs who are happy to give the second reading approval, but they won't be so happy with the 3 days of pressured debate and curtailed debate as they see it on the bill itself.
Yeah, that's really the nub of the issue. And I agree with Tim's analysis. I think there will be quite a few Labour MPs that cross a very big kind of moral line for them to throw the Prime Minister a political lifeline on Brexit. But they will be worried about the programme motion. Look, one of the former advisors, in fact, current advisor to the Prime Minister, Nicky Da Costa, said, look, a bill of this magnitude will needs about 4 weeks to be properly scrutinised. And so, 3 days doesn't quite cut it for people. So I think that is where the tension is going to come. But for any Labour MP that does break the whip and cross that line, this is a very big moment for them. Be very clear about that.
I was going to pick up on that, certainly, because for those Labour MPs who are so minded, there'll be lots of colleagues who'll be putting them under a lot of pressure.
There will, and not just colleagues, but wider parts of the movement. The trade union movement, as you know, is very closely aligned to the Labour Party. Workers' rights are something which people are feeling very, very worried about. The idea that there'll be a looser relationship with the EU might imperil workers' rights down the track. So the stakes are very, very high. It's not just about the dry, arid detail. It's a big values question for a lot of people on the Labour side and part of that movement.
But are we talking, a handful of MPs who are in that sort of area, or half a dozen, or what's your sense?
Well, the numbers aren't so clear. Look, at one point, Stephen Kinnock was leading a group of Labour MPs. He was saying, look, it could be around 40. I don't think it will be that high, but I wouldn't be surprised if you're looking at round about sort of 10 to 12 MPs, which would be enough to help the Prime Minister get over the line.
Just Tim and Catherine again, just in terms of the I'm calling it a timetable motion so that viewers understand what we're talking about here. If it's lost, let's just say for a second that the Prime Minister gets his second reading, but he fails to get his timetable as he wishes it. Where does that leave him?
Procedurally, you can just carry on, because it just means that you can't control how much time MPs spend on each bit. You can try and do other things. There's this thing called a closure motion where you can basically say, look, I think we now need to move on from this stage. But it means that the government have lost a lot of control. It means they're reliant on MPs voting to end each stage. So it could really drag out and out now. Their other option is they bring back another timetable motion, a different one that perhaps gives a bit more time to MPs, but that might mean having to go and ask for an extension, a short extension probably, but some kind of extension. At the moment, that's not what the government wants to do. On
the question of the extension, Tim, clearly it depends on the response in Brussels, but what's the thinking there in the Conservative Party on the kind of the need for possibly a short extension? And what if the EU says, well, actually, we'll do it if you have an election, or if they set conditions on it?
Yeah.
What's the thinking?
Well, the PM has said he will pull it if they lose the programme motion. He doesn't want an extension. It's not impossible to imagine there being one of a couple of weeks, and there have been some noises around that. It all rather depends on when the EU is willing to extend to. The EU is going to have to come together, debate what happens tonight, discuss what kind of extension to give. It's expected it'll be until January, which would certainly be plenty of time. But what the government probably ideally wants to do is to try to trigger an election, and to run an election on the theme of, we went to the EU, we got a deal, we brought it back. There might even have been support for it in the House, but the Remainers tried to stop us. So therefore, we want an election on whether or not Brexit itself should actually happen. I think the government's quite comfortable it could win that kind of an election.
Bear with us, because I'm just going to go straight back into the Chamber of the Commons to see what's going on, because it's filled up very nicely now again, and as we can see, a crowd of people, including Kenneth Clarke there, the father of the House, just at the bottom of the frame there, and getting all ready for this first vote to be announced. And it'll be, I reckon, in a few minutes' time. It's 12 minutes past 7 here at Westminster, so it won't be too long, I don't think. If I can bring Vicky Young back in again, who's outside the chamber for us. And Vicky, we're just looking at these pictures. I'm just wondering at this point, are you seeing any government whips or anything, any signals at all that would tell us something about how this vote might be going?
No, I think they're more relaxed, if that's the right word, about this one. I think they feel they have enough Labour MPs willing to pass the bill at this stage. Now, that doesn't mean that further down the line, if we get further down the line, that they won't try and make changes to it. I think they will. But at this point, This is in principle saying we support what's in this bill, which, to remind people, is of course the deal that Boris Johnson has done with the EU. This implements it, it's the legislation, it's the law that needs to be passed before the UK can leave the EU. Now, as you can see, it's completely packed in there. It normally takes about 15 minutes for a vote. Now, remember that Boris Johnson said today that if this one were to pass, and then the second vote, which is timetabling this bill to make sure it passes through this place quickly, that it can't be held up or dragged out for weeks or months. He says if the second part isn't passed and the EU grants a delay to Brexit, going to the end of January or even longer, then he says he'll pull the bill. Now, he can't actually pull the bill, but what he can do is sort of suspend it, really, so it doesn't go any further. Some are seeing that as a threat, particularly to maybe independent Labour and Conservative MPs. It's very hard to win in a general election if you are an independent MP. It does happen, but not very often. And so they think they're trying to really focus the minds of MPs to, as Downing Street would say, get Brexit done. And that has been the slogan all along. But others are saying it would be ridiculous for Boris Johnson to just decide, I can't go along with that timetable, and not even accept a delay of 2 or 3 weeks. Because that is the other option. Remember, when the EU has granted delays previously under Theresa May, they gave 2 dates. One, it would be, look, if you can get the deal through, then this would be the new date. If not, here's another date. That's what they've done in the past. We don't know what they will do this time, but it's possible they could follow a similar pattern with all of that. So that's for later, after the second vote, if we get to it. Here we go, here's the result.
Order! Order!
The ayes to the right, 329. The noes to the left, 299.
The ayes to the right, 329. The noes to the left, 299. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. Order. Programme motion to be moved formally.
I beg to move.
Move formally, thank you. The question is as on the order paper. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division! Clear the lobby.
So let's underline the significance of that vote. 329 to 299, a majority of 30 for the second reading, and that is the first time that the House of Commons has given its approval to any kind of Brexit deal. So that is the significance of that moment and the vote that has just taken place. So that majority may well give the government a bit of confidence about the next vote, which is the one we're looking at now, which is on the motion to manage the parliamentary timetable to bring the debate down to 3 days, which Vicky is still with us. Vicky, that is underway now. But first of all, a thought on that first vote from you.
Yeah, well, I mean, the government will look at that and say that that is a very healthy majority. Remember, Boris Johnson, since he became Prime Minister in July, let's just say he hasn't had much success winning votes in the House of Commons. I think he's only won one. So they will look at this and be pretty pleased, a healthy majority of 30. The question now, of course, is how many of those MPs can they hold on to, with the more contentious prospect of having a very swift passage for this bill through the House of Commons. Lots of MPs saying that they just don't think it's going to allow enough scrutiny for such an important piece of legislation. And earlier, there were Labour MPs who were publicly saying, look, they will back the second reading, that's the vote we've just had, but actually they wouldn't be prepared to go along with the timetable. They want longer to scrutinise such an important piece of legislation. So the groups we'll be looking at for the second vote will be Labour MPs and also those former Conservative MPs who you'll remember were kicked out of the party, 21 of them kicked out of the party because they voted against the government to try to prevent a no-deal Brexit. Many of them will have voted for this second reading because they want to make sure that there is a Brexit deal. How many of them, though, are unhappy about rushing this through Parliament. So they're the ones that the government is trying to cling on to. And I think a word about the DUP, of course, the Democratic Unionist Party, who have been propping up the Conservative government, but not so much today. They are absolutely furious about the deal that Boris Johnson has done with the EU. They've not backed him in that first vote. They are not going to back him in the second vote. And that's what makes this so much harder for the government. They are relying on Labour votes to get this through.
Vicky, thanks very much. Vicky Young there with the latest from the Houses of Parliament. As the second vote is underway, we'll be back in the chamber as soon as it happens. Quick word from my panel, from Catherine and Tim and Aisha. OK, a majority of 30 on the second reading. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, again, it's very significant. 30 might not seem like a large number when you're a minority government, a government that's, been trying to get this particular deal through. Boris Johnson brought in, by his party to do what Theresa May had failed to do over 3 years. She lost some of those votes by hundreds of votes. This is a really significant moment for Boris Johnson, but it's only the first stage in a bill. This is as much MPs want to get to the next stages of the bill. Some will want to bring amendments. Some will want to turn this Brexit into the kind of version that they want. And obviously, it all hangs on what happens next with this timetable motion.
Did you expect a 30 majority on that, Tim?
I'm going to lie and say yes. I feel rather emotional at this point, having followed this debate now for 9 months or so. Well, more than that. Probably about 10 or 11 months they've been trying to push the withdrawal agreement through the Commons. And to actually finally do it is quite a moment. That shows two things. One, the Prime Minister has significantly changed the withdrawal agreement so that he can win the support of Brexiteers and also of some Labour people too. That's very significant. He's achieved that, of course, by taking the backstop out and by moving so much from the withdrawal agreement to the political declaration. Nonetheless, it has changed. The other thing that I think shows has changed is over the summer, many MPs who might have been minded to block Brexit or delay it have realised their constituents are angry and they want the debate to move on. Now, we don't know the names of which Labour MPs voted which way, but some of them are sitting on majorities of, say, around 1,000 votes in leave voting areas. And those people have been told, if not by their constituency parties, then by their constituents, that they want out. So it's not just that the bill has changed, but also politics in this country has changed. And Remain, I sense, is starting to test the patience of many voters.
Aisha, your reading of that first vote?
Well, big moment. I thought it would pass. I didn't think the numbers would be that big. Someone's crunched numbers and said it's actually 48-52.
Yes.
If you look at it, the irony. But big moment. But it's kind of what comes next. Now, where I sort of slightly disagree with Tim is that I don't think that Remainers will be thinking, right, it's kind of over now. I mean, I was at the march on Saturday. People are worried about this, agreement for lots of reasons, notwithstanding not just the European Union, but the union here in the United Kingdom and the consequences on that. So while the slogan has been "Get Brexit Done," and it will feel that way with this vote, it's only just beginning.
Okay. Pause a second there. We'll be back with you in a moment. What I'd like to do now is go to the European Parliament in Strasbourg, where we've been following events in the day, and our correspondent Adam Fleming is there. So, Adam, we've had the first vote in this Parliament, a fairly hefty majority of 30, given the parliamentary arithmetic on the second reading. But all eyes, of course, now on this second vote. What's the thinking there?
Yeah, loads of diplomats have just actually texted me the same word, and the word they're all texting me is finally, as in finally some momentum, some approval from Parliament for the Brexit deal. Although they don't mean finally as in it's the end of the story, because everyone here and in Brussels knows there are still many more stages of this legislation to go through, not least, of course, the programming, the timetabling motion that you're all waiting for there. So as far as the EU is concerned, this is not a done deal at Westminster yet. Someone who's close to the negotiating team just said to me, there's still the scrutiny process and there could still be wrecking amendments, as they describe them. In other words, amendments that could change the substance of the deal and cause some massive problems for the process. And in terms of this place, the European Parliament, they will only vote on the deal themselves right at the very end, when there are no chance of it being modified any further at Westminster. In other words, when it's gone through all the Commons stages, all the Lords stages, gone back to the Commons, and then had the seal of approval from the Queen Royal Assent. Which means if we are to leave, if the UK is to leave on the 31st of October, the Brexit deadline, then the European Parliament could be voting on this as late as Thursday, Brexit Day itself.
Well, that's a thought, Adam, isn't it? And just another thing I wanted to ask you, just as we look at the MPs going through the lobbies there, they're voting, and the Commons is filling up once again, so it shouldn't be too long before we get a result. Just a quick question, Adam, if I may, before I let you go, which is to do with the possibility of another extension, and the Prime Minister earlier saying, well, he'll just, pull the bill if he's faced with what he thinks is too long an extension agreement from the EU. He doesn't really want that. What's the current thinking on that there?
So at the moment, Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, who chairs the summits of EU leaders, and they are the ones who will decide about an extension, he is consulting with the leaders based on the letter that Boris Johnson sent very unenthusiastically at the weekend, as he was compelled to do, asking for an extension to the end of January next year. Now, you hear lots of dates from people around this place, but for now it is speculation, because EU leaders are waiting to see what happens tonight, particularly with the timetable, and can the government stick to this blistering timetable it is setting for itself. In an ideal world for the EU, of course, all this legislation would go through. Brexit Day would be the 31st of October, as the government wants. The next best option would be a short delay, maybe of a couple of weeks until the middle of November. Next best option after that would be that end of January date. But then you hear people speculating that if there's a bigger problem that needs to be solved at Westminster, then you might see an extension to March, to June, to December. Nobody really knows, because they're waiting to see what happens. Sorry, it's an unsatisfying answer, but that's how it goes.
Adam, it's good. Thank you very much. Adam Fleming there for us in Strasbourg. So as we wait for the result, the second result, let's bring you up to date with what's going on right now. Just to remind you, Parliament right now, House of Commons voting on the government's proposal of a 3-day timetable to consider this very complex Brexit bill. Opposition MPs have been critical of the shortened time frame, some Conservatives too, to scrutinise the legislation. But Boris Johnson says he'll abandon the bill and push for a general election if MPs vote down his proposed timetable. If that doesn't happen, here's how the rest of the week is looking at this point. On Wednesday, amendments to the bill will be laid and chosen by the Speaker, such as plans for a customs union or confirmatory referendum on the deal. MPs will have lots of ideas on amendments. Thursday, we'll see MPs given the chance to vote again on the bill with any new amendments that have been attached. And if it all gets wrapped up in the Commons, the bill will then head to the House of Lords for approval. But again, just to underline, if tonight's vote on the timetable is rejected, well, the government then has little hope, according to all the observers, of completing Brexit by the 31st of October, which of course is the Prime Minister's pledge. So with that in mind, and just as we wait for this second vote result coming up, I'm going to introduce our economics editor Faisal Islam and our reality check correspondent Chris Morris. Good to have you all with this again. Let's have a think, Chris, first of all, about the importance of this second vote and what it could do to the process.
Well, the idea of trying to get this entire piece of legislation through in 3 days is pretty unprecedented. It's 400 plus pages of the bill plus all the accompanying documents. Very difficult for MPs to do it in that time. And you could sense during the debate today that there was real anger, actually, that the government was trying to push it through at such pace. If you can't do it in 3 days and it stretches into next week, you really are running out of time, because don't forget, it's not just about ratification on this side of the channel, both in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. It has to be ratified in the European Parliament as well. And they've said very clearly, we're not going to make a move until, I don't think they use the word mess, but until the mess in Westminster clears up a little. So this is sort of the government's last chance to do it on the 31st of October. I think, and we heard various people in the debate saying this, Rory Stewart, for example, saying if the government were prepared to extend just for a few more days, to give us a few more days to scrutinise this bill properly, then perhaps they could get somewhere. But the 31st has been set up as such a totemic do-or-die deadline that it's become very difficult for the government to back down on that.
Before I bring Faisal in, I think we have some social media, a tweet, I think, from Leila Moran, who's a Lib Dem MP. And look at this, because she's in the lobby, obviously, voting against the timetable motion. The DUP, Northern Ireland's DUP, who, of course, have been very important parliamentary allies of the government, the DUP in the lobby is voting no with us, says Leila Moran, and some Labour leaves too. So we hope we have defeated the government. Let's see. see. So that's just a bit of Lib Dem intelligence from the voting lobbies there. One of the features, Faisal, of the debate today was to do with the extent to which MPs are able to scrutinise the economic impact of this legislation, and saying that, you know, it's such a significant thing, and it's such a very important thing for future generations as well. They need far more than 3 days. What are you being told on that?
Well, there's three factors here. Chris talked about the haste of the 3 days. There's the fact that there's no economic impact assessment. Yeah. We've had those in the past. The government says they don't quite have the time, but it's also fairly clear if they deployed the same methodology as previously used, of course, this deal would be better in economic terms, according to their models, than no deal, which is why they call it a net economic positive. The Bank of England governor told me that at the weekend too. But compared to the status quo, compared even to Theresa May's deal, it could well come out worse, and that's because compared to both those counterfactuals, there would be more trade frictions with our biggest partner in the EU. But also, and this is the big surprise, and it's why we've just seen that piece of intelligence about the DUP, there were trade frictions within the United Kingdom between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And not just Great Britain to Northern Ireland, but Northern Ireland to Great Britain as well. Now, the government's argument is just a technicality, it's basically filling in a computer form, but the fact that so-called export declarations, export summary declarations would be required is, I think, for the DUP, pretty offensive. And you do wonder, the big picture here, how in trying to deal with the backstop, to renegotiate Theresa May's deal, to deal with the DUP's issues with the backstop, they've come up with a deal that has alienated them even more. And the answer to that question is the big picture economics. This is a Prime Minister that wants total freedom to do international trade deals, thinks he's got a mandate for that, and was willing to alienate the DUP in order to get it. But that would have consequences for the economic assessment that we're not going to see.
Well, it could be very costly in terms of this vote.
Well,
coming
let's
up,
see.
to
It
say
could
the
be
least.
the difference.
So the House is packed once again. The tellers will soon be in their place by the dispatch boxes there. They're just gathering. So we're within a minute or so, I think, of getting this result. And Vicky Young is still in the central lobby of Parliament, just a few yards away from the Chamber of the Commons there. And this one looks much tighter than the last one, Vicky.
Yeah, I think everyone thinks that this will be much closer. I just saw the Chief Whip. Now, he's the person who is in charge of making sure that Conservative MPs vote with the government or persuading opposition MPs to vote with the government. He just crouched down in front of Boris Johnson on the front bench and had a word with him. Impossible to tell from the body language which way this has gone, but I do think it's going to be close. It's certainly not going to be a healthy government majority of 30. And then once we've got that result, it's worth listening out to what happens next. If it goes through, we move straight to the next stage of that bill. So it's called the committee stage, and they will start within a couple of minutes talking about the detail of the bill. So moving on very, very quickly to talk about what changes they might want to make. That will last for a couple of days. If it doesn't go through, Boris Johnson has said if the EU make it a long delay to Brexit till the end of January or longer, then actually he'll suspend this whole process, and actually instead he'll go for a general election. So what we're going to be looking out for afterwards, if the government were to lose, does Boris Johnson get up and address MPs to say what his plan is? Does the leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, maybe get up and say what their plan is? They could even table a motion for a general election. It doesn't mean they have to move it tomorrow. They don't have to go ahead with it, but they could even do that to indicate that they're serious about wanting a general election. And we know that Boris Johnson, all the way through this since becoming Prime Minister, has said again and again, we are leaving with or without a deal on the 31st of October. Here you go.
Order! Order!
The ayes to the right, 308. The noes to the left, 322.
Bad news for Boris Johnson. Here's the Speaker.
The ayes to the right, 308. The noes to the left, 322. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock.
So the question is now, will the Prime Minister make a statement following that?
Point of order, Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Saturday, this House emphatically rejected the Prime Minister's deal. Tonight, the House has... Well, you're too hasty. I've not finished yet. Tonight, the House has refused to be bounced into debating a hugely significant piece of legislation in just 2 days, with barely any notice and an analysis of the economic impact of this bill. The Prime Minister is the author of his own misfortune. So I make this offer to him tonight. Work with us, all of us, to agree a reasonable timetable, and I suspect this House will vote to debate, scrutinise and, I hope, amend the detail of this bill. That would be the sensible way forward, and that's the offer I make on behalf of the opposition tonight.
Point of order, the Prime Minister. Point of order.
Let me say in response, Mr. Speaker, how welcome it is, even joyful, that for the first time in this long saga, this House has actually accepted its responsibilities together, come together and embraced a deal. I congratulate honourable members across the House on the scale of our collective achievement, because just a few weeks ago hardly anybody believed that we could reopen the withdrawal agreement, let alone abolish the backstop. That is indeed what they were saying. And certainly nobody thought that we could secure the approval of the House for a new deal. And we should not overlook the significance of this moment. And I pay particular tribute to those members of the House who were sceptical and who had difficulties and doubts and who decided to place the national interest ahead of any other consideration. But, Mr. Speaker, I must express my disappointment that the House has again voted for delay, rather than a timetable that would have guaranteed that the UK would be in a position to leave the EU on October the 31st with a deal. And we now face further uncertainty, and the EU must now make up their minds over how to answer Parliament's request for a delay. And the first consequence, Mr. Speaker, is that the government must take the only responsible course and accelerate our preparations for a no-deal outcome. But secondly, I will speak to EU member states about their intentions until they have reached a decision. Until they've reached a decision, I must say, we will pause this legislation. And let me be clear. Our policy remains that we should not delay, that we should leave the EU on October the 31st, and that is what I will say to the EU, and I will report back to the House. And one way or another, we will leave the EU with this deal to which this House has just given its assent. And I thank members across the House for that hard-won agreement.
Point of order, Mr. Ian Blackford.
Parliamentary Leader of the SNP.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I must say I find the response of the Prime Minister quite extraordinary, because the facts of the matter are...
Order. The right honourable gentleman is entitled to raise a point of order, and he is entitled to be heard. Let's hear the right honourable member, and then we will expedite progress. Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The facts of the matter are this is yet another humiliating defeat for the Prime Minister this evening, who has sought to railroad through this House legislation that requires proper scrutiny. And rightly, this House has spoken with a very clear voice to tell the Prime Minister he is not on. And furthermore, it is absolutely crystal clear what should now happen, because there is legislation passed by this House. It is the law of the land, on the basis of not agreeing a deal, that the Prime Minister is instructed, Prime Minister, to seek an extension. Go to Brussels and do as you have been instructed, and do not put yourself offside against this Parliament. Mr. Speaker, it is crystal clear that this is a government that has no confidence, but a government that has sought to ignore the wishes of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish people. It is obvious to us that if we want to guarantee our rights as EU citizens, then Scotland has to become an independent country. To that end,
Ian Blackford of the Scottish National Party giving his response to these two important votes we've had this evening in the Commons. Let me just recap, if you've just joined us here on this BBC News special at Westminster. The first vote was on the legislation itself, on the second reading, and that is a vote that the Prime Minister and the Conservative government won by a majority of 30. And then the second vote went against Boris Johnson. This was on the timetabling. Mr Johnson wanting the parliamentary debate to be done in 3 days, while MPs by a majority of 14, 322 to 308, saying, we're not happy with that. We think this legislation is so important, it needs far longer to be considered. So two extremely important votes in their own different ways. Vicky Young, our chief political correspondent, is in the central lobby. Let's listen to Kenneth Clarke, the Father of the House, first of all.
The Father of the House, is it your first, sir?
Can I ask the Prime Minister and everybody else to reconsider the suggestion he made that we pause the progress of the bill tomorrow? I congratulate him on winning approval for the deal he negotiated. I think, said in the House once, I would apologise to him and congratulate him if he actually got it, and he has achieved it. And the second reading vote was the approval of his deal. The argument is how long the House is allowed to take over considering it. I can't quite see the logic of pausing progress on the bill when the whole House is expecting the next 2 days to be spent on it. It would enable us to see how quickly the House is actually proceeding, what sort of time is being looked for, and it may enable then, if people start filibustering, which I hope they won't, for the government to get a majority for a timetable motion if it came back, which was a modest adjustment to the one he had, because I think 3 or 4 days more would certainly do it.
Grateful to the right honourable and learned gentleman, the Father of the House, for his point of order, and I await.
So the Father of the House, the most senior MP in the House of Commons, Kenneth Clarke, former Chancellor, making his point. So let's pause there for a second. I've just underlined the significance of these two votes. The first, as I say, on the legislation itself, which Boris Johnson won pretty heftily in terms of this Parliament, because the Commons figures are very tight, a majority of 30, and it's the first time that MPs have given their approval to any kind of Brexit deal. But on the second vote, the vote to do with how long MPs have got to debate it, well, he lost that by a majority of 14. So let's join Vicky Young once again in the central lobby.
Yeah, that's right. And the Prime Minister now has a very important decision to make. Is he willing to accept a little bit more time to go through the process of this bill, but thereby breaking his promise to leave the EU do or die on the 31st of October? Or is he going to really ditch this legislation and somehow try to push for a general election? But really all eyes, I think, on Brussels now as to whether and how long the delay to Brexit that they will grant. How long will it be? How long will it take for them to say what they are willing to do? Let's get some immediate reaction from the Conservative MP, Gillian Keegan, who is with me now. What do you make of what has just happened?
I think actually it's excellent news that the Prime Minister's deal has gone through. So I think that, and by 30 votes, so that is probably better than we were expecting. And that for the country is really the most important point, because if that hadn't have gone through, then basically it would have meant we don't have a deal after trying several different deals. So that probably will give also our European friends some hope that actually there is a deal that can get through this place. In terms of the timescale, it is disappointing because actually I read this thing last night, 110 pages. It's not dissimilar in almost 90% of it is the same as the the things that we've been reading for the last few years. So actually, what I really think is going on in the House of Commons is the last people who really do want a second referendum, who actually are still not willing to accept this deal, and this is their last kind of stand. I think it's surprised everybody that Boris actually got a deal, and I think today it will have surprised everybody that not only has he got a deal, he's got a deal that has passed through the House, albeit we still need to now have some more clarity on what happens with timescales.
And what do you think, what would you hope that the EU would do now? Given that Boris Johnson has written that letter, he had to, under law, to say that he's requested a delay to Brexit.
I'm a reasonable kind of person, so the way I would approach it is basically say, you can have another week and that's it. And then, we have to sit night and day. The Lords are willing to sit over the weekend. We've spent enough time talking about it. We do have to make some decisions, and sometimes you just need that pressure of time to do it. We've left it all to the last moment, like, as usual, I guess, as people do with their big things that they need to do. But
did Boris Johnson sit down with Jeremy Corbyn? The Labour leader said, I'm willing to work with you to get forward a reasonable timetable for this.
I don't think he is. Jeremy Corbyn just wants, well, I don't know what he wants, but most of his Labour Party wants a second referendum. And that's abdicating our duty. As MPs, we come here. This is a very difficult thing to do, and it is very complex. No matter what people say, it is very complex. It's almost whole economy stuff, and international trade is a huge, huge factor in it. So it's abdicating our duty as MPs. We get paid to do this heavy lifting, so we should do it. I don't trust that Jeremy Corbyn wants to get Brexit done at all. He wants a second referendum to basically abdicate back to the people, which would be so divisive, and I just don't think the country deserves that.
Okay, Gillian Keegan, thank you very much indeed. So all eyes will be on Brussels and also on the government to see what their next steps are.
Vicky, thanks very much, and thanks to your guest, Gillian Keegan, as well. Commons is still pretty packed, lots of points of order being made, but why don't I get some reaction now from my panel who've rejoined me? Catherine Haddon from the Institute for Government, the leader writer from the Daily Telegraph, Tim Stanley, and the former Labour senior advisor, Aisha Hazarika. Good to have you back with us. So we've got something to talk about now, haven't we? So 30 majority for Boris Johnson on our first one, which we've discussed. So let's discuss the fact that he then suffered a setback on the second vote.
Absolutely, and it was a bit bigger than some have been talking about, could have been just 5 or something like that. And we've been hearing all day about what he might do. He might entirely sort of set aside the vote and actually push for a general election. Obviously, lots of speculation about, well, you could continue anyway, you could, and Jeremy Corbyn trying to say, let's look for a different timetable for this vote. Instead, what the Prime Minister has done is said, I'm going to take a pause, I'm going to see what the EU offer in terms of an extension, and then I might come back and say what was going to be the next steps.
Because interestingly, Tim, Ken Clarke was on his feet saying just 3 or 4 days would do it. Lots of MPs today have been saying we need weeks to look at this legislation, but Kenneth Clarke said, 3 or 4 days would actually do the trick. Do you think that's right?
A lot of viewers will be wondering, why doesn't the government just hit pause and wait a little bit longer? Well, 2 reasons. One, as we keep coming back to that political date of October the 31st, although that now seems impossible. So again, why not just hit pause? Well, it's the question of amendment. Let's say this gets really amended when it's being debated. Let's say they MPs start adding things like a customs union, or start shifting things that were moved into the political declaration back into the Dáil agreement. The problem with that is that if this bill gets greatly amended by the House, first of all, the Prime Minister's got to take it back to the Europeans, who effectively got to reopen it and present it to them as a whole new thing. The other problem is that the votes that the Prime Minister picked up from Brexiteers by reopening and renegotiating the withdrawal agreement, by ending the backstop and the customs union element, those things would then be put back into it. So any Labour rebel votes that he might be able to nail down through this process will, on the other hand, you're going to lose loads of Brexiteers. You're going to lose loads of ERG people. So it's perfectly possible that if you have an extended legislative period in which you kick this bill around the House, you might come to the end of it and find you've actually lost that majority that he had for the second reading. So another reason where it's not just about the politics and the optics, there's also the government's thinking, we've got our deal, we've negotiated it, this is 95% the same as what Theresa May put to the House, so why won't the Commons just get on with it? And they're gambling politically that most people will be watching that and thinking, what has the Commons done tonight? Why do they want to delay this? If they're for it, why not just get it done?
What did you make, Aisha, of Jeremy Corbyn's response and the offer? Lots of MPs make offers in this way because they want to appear to be constructive and collaborative and all the rest of it. But what did you make of the response that he made, which was to say, look, why can't we discuss a more sensible timetable to all of this?
Well, I think that's quite smart politics for Jeremy Corbyn. His line, remember, is he doesn't want to deny people Brexit. He's saying that let's have the right scrutiny. And interestingly, the whips from the Labour Party wrote to the whips from the Conservative Party this afternoon saying, look, is there a deal to be done in terms of a wee bit more time? Because remember, this is critical. This is a bill which is going to affect not just us, but our children, our grandchildren. And again, where I slightly disagree with Tim, it's not just the backstop and the issue of the customs union. What a lot of Labour MPs are very exercised about is workers' rights. That was moved from the withdrawal agreement to the political declaration. The political declaration is a statement of intent. A lot of people don't trust Boris Johnson. If you look at how the DUP were treated this week, you can see why. So perhaps if Boris Johnson was prepared to move those workers' rights back to the withdrawal agreement, and remember, that was in the deal that Theresa May negotiated, so the EU would probably be happy with that. Maybe he could get some of those Labour MPs to really solidify. But it doesn't seem ignoble for parliamentarians to just ask for a bit more time to scrutinise this. Remember, the Prime Minister's own legislative advisor is on the record as saying a bill of this magnitude needs about 4 weeks of scrutiny.
Yeah, that was Nicky Costa, yeah.
And this is all about parliamentary sovereignty and taking back control.
If you're wondering what the response in Brussels is, well, we're still waiting for it, but Adam Fleming, our correspondent, has just put this on social media. He saw Michel Barnier just a short while ago after tonight's votes, and a very solid no comment so far from Michel Barnier. Isn't that a surprise? But they'll be taking their time in terms of response. And Boris Johnson made it quite clear that he's waiting to see what the response from the EU is in terms of what they might say about an extension and the kind of extension that they might have in mind here. So clearly there's lots of room for manoeuvre still there. Well, let's join Vicky again, who I think has the former Attorney General Dominic Grieve with her.
Yeah, that's right. MPs taking in what has just happened. The second reading has been passed, so MPs have demonstrated that they back Boris Johnson's deal, but it's the timetable that's the problem. Let's speak to Dominic Grieve, Independent Conservative MP now. What do you think the Prime Minister should do now?
He should find a suitable timetable and try and take his legislation through. I don't understand the government's tactics. They've succeeded at second reading. That means that a majority of the House of Commons have expressed in principle, it's important to emphasise that word, a view that this bill ought to be given proper consideration and may be passed. But they also want time to scrutinise it properly and propose amendments. That's what we do in this place. And so instead of giving us a sensible timetable, and the constitutional bill of this sort would normally get 8 weeks to go through Commons and Lords. That's what Theresa May programmed for a very similar bill back in the spring. You can shorten that a bit, but saying you're going to have 3 days in the House of Commons is frankly insulting, and it's also wrong, which is why he's been defeated. Now, if he wants to have a proper, sensible process, he may or may not succeed in getting his bill through at third reading. It may be amended in ways that he doesn't like. I simply don't know.
He thinks, doesn't he, that there will be people, and he would probably include you in this, who would want to amend it to make it almost unrecognisable.
Forgive my saying it, I don't think I want to amend it to make it unrecognisable. I do want to amend it to put a referendum in it. That's a different matter. But the House of Commons is entitled to amend it. This is where the Prime Minister seems to me to be behaving so badly. And now I don't know what he's doing. He's pausing it. There was a suggestion earlier today he was immediately going to threaten a general election. Well, he's entitled to try and trigger a general election. But it's this sort of inexplicable behaviour which I think tends to try to mask the government's own failings and to lay blame everywhere else. And ultimately, it's very corrosive of trust between MPs and government. And whilst this may succeed in the short term in getting him news headlines, in the long term, it's really corrosive. And I think it will do him and the government damage. And I am mystified. And I think actually a lot of my colleagues who were prepared to support the government this evening were also horrified about the way the government was behaving.
I mean, Boris Johnson, interestingly, did say we will leave the EU with this deal. He didn't mention a date, and he didn't mention no deal.
Well, maybe that is his intention, and if I may say so, he's fully entitled to it, and it may be he can get this deal through Parliament, taking it through its ordinary stages. Alternatively, he may decide to hold a general election, but it's a very odd moment to give up. This was the loss of the programme motion was utterly predictable and the result of the government's own actions.
Okay, Dominic Grieve, thank you very much indeed. So the big question, will Boris Johnson change his mind, accept a slightly different timetable? But of course that would mean breaking his promise to leave on October the 31st.
Indeed, Vicky, thanks very much again. Vicky Young with Dominic Grieve there, and the time is 8 minutes to 8 on this BBC News special from Westminster on the night that MPs for the first time have given their formal approval to a Brexit deal. That's the first time that's happened. But they have turned down the proposed timetable for debate on this Brexit bill because they've said to Boris Johnson the 3 days is nowhere near enough. And the result is that the Prime Minister has now paused the bill. He's paused the legislation in response to the vote tonight. So we're in a very odd place. So let's discuss how odd it is with Chris Morris, our reality check correspondent, and our economics editor, Faisal Islam. How odd is it, Chris?
Well, first of all, listening to what the Prime Minister said, one way or another we will leave with this deal. No mention of October the 31st. No. So is that the moment he knew the do it or die pledge was over? Secondly, earlier in the day we'd had Downing Street sources saying if this vote goes down, he'll pull the bill altogether, not pause it, try to go straight for a general election. That didn't happen, so you do wonder, there's a lot of distrust in the House of Commons at the moment after the prorogation saga and so forth, how many times they can sort of bluff and bluster. Thirdly, he said he's going to consult other EU leaders. If he's really going to try, as has been suggested, to say to them, we don't want any delay, what he's really saying to them is, can you push through no deal for me? And they're simply not going to do that. So I guess we are in a place that we know we've been in for a long time, which is a really very strange stalemate.
What are the implications, do you think, in terms of keeping an eye on how the markets react to all of these things? Because clearly that's a very important part of the picture. Are we in a position to say anything about that tonight?
Well, sterling, which had been trading up on the day, is now a bit down on the day. It's not a huge move, but it shows you how things have flipped. I think a few weeks ago I was standing here with you and sterling kind of moved against the government, and now it sort of moves slightly with the government, which is an intriguing shift. Basically, there is a sort of, it seems like Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, thinks that there is a slim route now to no deal via the European Union. But I think I'm right in saying that all the EU need to do now is accept January the 31st, and then that's it. In EU law, exit date moves to January the 31st with no negotiation. Now, if they come back and say a different date, shorter date, perhaps a longer date, if they have a discussion, a debate and an argument about it, then there is a return of serve from here of some description, which might get complicated. So one does wonder if the EU might do some sort of hybrid thing, which is kind of provisionally accept end of January, just to get that sorted in EU law, but then provide some flexibility forward or back. So it seems difficult to me, as Chris said, to imagine how they would say no to that extension.
Gents, just pause there for a second because I want to bring in Ian Lavery, who's chair of the Labour Party, who's joining us now. Ian, thanks very much for waiting to talk to us. What do you make of tonight's events?
Well, listen, it's a significant defeat for Boris Johnson tonight with the programme motion. It's basically down to trust. And the Commons do not trust the Conservative Party. The Commons do not trust Boris Johnson. And the whole debate today in and around the Commons is being about trust. That isn't any trust in this government. Therefore, you've seen tonight another significant defeat. And basically, what we're asking for was basic. We wanted to discuss and we wanted the ability to amend a 435-page collective documents in order to put forward a compromise deal so we can exit Brexit on a deal which can be agreed by the Commons. It's about compromise, and the Labour Party have offered compromise.
What about the Labour Party's stance tonight, Ian, on the question of a general election? The Prime Minister did mention an election earlier today. I noticed that he didn't say anything in the statement there after the votes. But what would Labour's answer to that be tonight after these votes have taken place?
Well, basically, what the Prime Minister actually said that day, he was annoyed, he was upset that he didn't get his own way. He said that he would pause the legislation. He said that he would wait for a reply from the EU on the issue. But let me be crystal clear about a general election. The Labour Party want a general election. We've said this all along, but what we've also said, we will not, under any circumstances, accept the sellout Brexit deal. We'll not do that. It's a sellout to the people. It's a sellout to everyone in the country. We want a no-deal Brexit off the table before we'll consider even accepting that we move forward with a general election. Take that off the table, we'll have a general election.
When you look at the next few weeks and you wait for the response from the EU, what are your thoughts on the options for the kind of extra delay, if you like, that the EU is likely to offer to the UK? I mean, what are you expecting?
Well, I think it's obviously up to the EU. I would have thought the situation would be that they would come back with some form of extension, possibly to January 2020, in order to allow some form of compromise deal to come forward. You know, the Labour Party are willing to negotiate. We are willing to have further concessions and discussions on this deal, the sellout deal which Boris Johnson's put forward. We can change this deal, we can amend it so it's acceptable right across the piece, and we can get a deal offered to right across the country.
Ian, thanks very much again for joining us. Ian Lavery there, the chairman of the Labour Party. That's it for now on an evening of real political significance at Westminster. MPs for the first time backing a Brexit bill but rejecting the government's timetable. From Westminster, good night.